Here are the 3 budget commanders you should be playing, starting with Octavia Living Thesis. Octavia Living Thesis costs 10 mana, 8 and 2 blue. It's an 8/8 elemental octopus. This spell costs 8 less to cast if you have 8 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard. It also has ward 8, which means if an opponent tries to target our commander, they have to pay an additional 8 mana. And then there is Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, target creature has base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. Now let's talk about what this deck wants to do. This deck wants to put as many instants and sorceries into our deck as soon as possible. So we have cards like Shirei for 2 mana. Look at the top 2 cards of your library, put any number of them into your graveyard, and put the rest on the top of your library in any order. We can also draw a card. Deranged Assistant. This is also a way we can get ramp in our deck, just that consistent 1 colorless mana. But whenever we tap Deranged Assistant, we get to put the top card of our library into our graveyard, or we could just shorten that to we mill 1, add 1 colorless mana. Dream Twist. This is a perfect turn 1 card. We play an island, play Dream Twist for 1 blue mana. It's an instant. Target player puts the top 3 cards into his or her library into their graveyard. It also has Flashback, which we can cast this on turn 2 if we don't have anything else to do. Strategic Planning. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. What's great is that these instants and sorceries are also going into our graveyard on top of what they're already doing. So this is twice or even 3 times as effective for our commander to be coming out by turn 3 or 4. Taigam Scheming. Look at the top 5 cards of your library, put any of them into your graveyard and the rest on top of your library in any order. So if we have just an amazing top 5 cards that are all instants and sorceries and we cast this on turn 2, that's 6 instants and or sorceries in our graveyard, but again, that's the best scenario I can think of. Thought Scour. Playing this turn 1 is great as well. For 1 blue, target player puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, so we mill 2, we get to draw a card as well. And then Tome Scour, even better for 1 blue. Target player mills 5 cards. Great for turn 1. So that's the idea of filling our graveyard. Now let's move on to removal, which we're just going to touch on a little bit. Cards like Negate, we get to counter non-creature spell. Resculpt, for 2 mana, we get to exile an artifact or creature, and they're instead going to get a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. There's also Rewind, we can counter any spell, and we get to untap 4 lands. If we need to take care of a lot of creatures, Curse of the Swine is going to be the one for us. For 2 blue and an X, we get to exile X creatures, and instead of whatever creature they have, they're going to get a 2/2 green boar creature token. Now, since we're going to be using a lot of instants and sorceries, it's possible we're going to want some of them back, so we have cards like Archaeomancer and Flood of Recollection. Whenever Archaeomancer enters the battlefield, we can return a target instant or sorcery from our grave back to our hand. There's also Flood of Recollection, return target instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand, and then we have to exile this card. As for the token makers in this deck, we have Murmuring Mystic, Towering Sky Summoner, and Whispering Wizard. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, we are going to be rewarded for that. There's also Rise from the Tides. For every instant and sorcery in our graveyard, this is going to get us a 2/2 zombie, and they do enter tapped. Now my favorite part of any deck is talking about card draw, so let's talk about Verity Circle. Nobody plays this, but it's super great. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped and it wasn't declared an attacker, we get to draw a card. So whenever they tap one of their mana dorks, such as Llanowar Elves, we get to draw a card from that. Treasure Cruise. Whenever we cast our commander and we no longer need all those instants and sorceries in our graveyard, or we just have a bunch of lands in there from milling unexpected cards like that, we can Delve, which makes this spell much easier to cast, and we get to draw 3 cards from this. Reconnaissance Mission. I'll mention it very shortly, but we have creatures that are going to be able to deal our opponents a lot of damage, and we're going to be able to draw cards from it with this one. Mind Unbound. One of my favorite cards that nobody plays for 6 mana. At our upkeep, we get to put a lore counter on Mind Unbound, and then we're going to draw a card for each lore counter on Mind Unbound, so this can get out of hand pretty quickly. Insight. Whenever one of your opponents plays a green spell, you get to draw a card. So if your opponents really like to play green, try throwing this in one of your decks. This might be worth it. Now, while there are more card draw cards, let's just mention Wavebreak Hippocamp for the last one. Whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, we get to draw a card. Since there's a lot of instants in this deck, we're going to be able to take advantage of drawing cards from this one. Moving on to how we're going to be dealing our opponent's damage, we have a lot of unblockable creatures, such as Invisible Stalker, Looter Ilkor, Mistcloaked Herald, and Nurok Invisimancer. Again, there's more cards in this category, but we're just going to mention these 4 because you get the idea. These creatures are unblockable, and what's great about that is with our commander, Octavia Living Thesis, every time we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we get to make creatures 8/8s until end of turn. So these 1/1 unblockable creatures now become 8/8 unblockable creatures. So this can be very powerful for this deck. And last, I want to mention the MVPs for the deck. And yes, I said MVPs because I have 3 of them in this deck. Ghostly Pilferer. I never played this card, but in this deck, it is a powerhouse. When it becomes untapped, you can pay 2. If you do, draw a card. Whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, draw a card. But it also has, you can discard a card and this can't be blocked until end of turn. We can repeatedly use that discard a card, so if we have a bunch of instants and sorceries in our hand, we can just dump them all into the graveyard and potentially cast our commander that much faster. Hard evidence. You're probably looking at this and saying, why is this an MVP? Well, for 1 blue mana, we get a 0/3 blue crab creature token, and we get a clue token from investigating, which means we get an artifact token that says you can pay 2, sacrifice this, and draw a card. I really like this because we have that blue crab creature token that can become a potential 8/8. Hard evidence is a sorcery, so when we cast it, it goes to our graveyard when it resolves or is even countered. So that's 1 more card for Octavia, and we get more card draw with making those clue tokens. The last MVP is Willbreaker. If we reread Octavia, we get to target a creature. It doesn't have to be just ours. So whenever we start targeting our opponent's creatures with Willbreaker, they will become under our control when we target an opponent's creature with any of our spells or abilities, as long as we control Willbreaker. So the price of this deck is $20. For this mono blue deck, this is going to be a ton of fun. There are going to be some hit and misses, but trust me, if you are not a mono blue player, this might be the one for you. Or if you really like taking advantage of casting 8/8 for 2 blue mana, that's another great reason for this deck. Or if you like putting 8/8s that are unblockable to hit your opponents. For $20, this is a great deck to start with. Moving on to Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker. I mentioned this deck a lot, so I'll just go over it very briefly. If you want a more in-depth video of it, I'll have that linked in the description down below. So Shirei, for 5 mana, is a 2/2 spirit. Whenever a creature with power 1 or less is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you can return it to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step if Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker, is still on the battlefield. What's important to note is that this is on each end step, so this can be on your opponent's end step as well. Our commander is very important to us, so let's talk about how we can protect Shirei, which is with Dark Privilege and cards like Mask of Avacyn, giving our commander hexproof or even a way to regenerate it. And then we also want cards that have ETBs, such as Clattering Augur, Dusk Legion Zealot, and Skyscanner. When these enter the battlefield, we get to draw a card, and what's great about that is because we're going to be bringing these creatures back every end step, so we can have a total of 4 cards drawn in 1 turn cycle from just one of these creatures. And moving on to the sack outlets we're going to be wanting, so we can keep triggering our commander's awesome ability, we have cards like Blood Baron, Bloodflow Connoisseur, and Blood Throne Vampire. We just get to sacrifice creatures, and we do get some benefit for these sack outlets, but that's not what my focus is. We want ways to sacrifice these awesome creatures that can enter the battlefield and get us a bunch of benefits, and these are the way we're going to do it. As for ramp of the deck, there is some mana rocks like Arcane Signet and Mind Stone. Pretty boring stuff, but we can use creatures as well to get us mana, such as Blood Pet, or even making us treasure tokens like Skullport Merchant. You've probably never even seen that card because it's probably not very good in any other deck. It also has a sack outlet on it as well. Now, making tokens in this deck is super awesome. We have Desecrated Tomb and Tormod the Desecrator. What's great about these cards is that whenever a creature card would leave our graveyard, we get a token. But with Shirei and how it's worded, it's for every creature that is leaving the graveyard. So if we get 4 creatures back every end step, we're making additional 4 1/1 black bats with Desecrated Tomb. Or we're getting 4 2/2 black zombies from Tormod. Again, if you want a more in-depth deck tech over Shirei, definitely check out that video in the description down below. The price of this deck is $30, which is crazy to me. This is the most controlling budget deck I've ever been involved in making. Definitely one you should consider if you love mono black and taking advantage of graveyard interactions. The last commander I want to talk about is Delina, Wild Mage. For 3 and a red, we get a 3/2 Elf Shaman. Whenever Delina attacks, we get to choose target creature we control, and then we're going to roll a d20. If we roll 1 through 14, we're going to create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary, and it has exile this creature at the end of combat. If we roll 15 through 20, we get to create one of those tokens and roll again. So we don't have to exile them at the end of combat. We get to keep them. What's great about that is we have a lot of token makers like Beetleback Chief, Mogwar Marshal, and Mere Battlesphere. When these enter the battlefield, we get tokens. And so if we're creating all these copies of target creature, for example, Mere Battlesphere, we get 4 1/1 colorless Mere artifact creature tokens when this enters the battlefield. When we target it with our commander, and we can roll literally anything from 1 to 20, we're creating another copy of it. But if we get 15 through 20, potentially continuously keep doing this over and over, getting us a huge amount of tokens and overwhelming our opponents. Moving on to removal very quickly, because not always always the most fun thing to talk about, we have a Braid. For 2 mana, we can choose to deal 3 to target creature or destroy an artifact. There's also Chaos Warp. We can take care of any permanent on the battlefield, and at random, our opponent shuffles their library, and they get the top card of their library. There's also Meteor Golem. This has an ETB, so if we target it with our commander, we can potentially destroy a lot of things on our opponent's side that are permanents. Same with Duplicant. When this enters the battlefield, we can exile target non-token creature, and if we keep rolling 15 through 20, we get multiple copies of this. We can take care of a lot of threats. Some more ETBs of the deck, I want to talk about Swarming Goblins. When it enters the battlefield, we get to roll a d20. If we get 1 through 9, we get a 1/1 Goblin. 10 through 19, 2 of those tokens. 20, we get 3 of those tokens. So we're going to be rolling a lot of d20s if we're targeting this with our commander. Inferno Titan, when it enters or attacks, it deals 3 damage among any targets 1, 2, or 3. What's important to note is that the token that Delina is making, if we target Inferno Titan, those tokens come in tapped and attacking, so it doesn't trigger Inferno Titans deal 3 damage. There's also Goblin Chain Whirler. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 to each opponent and to each creature and planeswalker they control. There's also Coercive Recruiter. When this or another pirate enters the battlefield under your control, you gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature, and until end of turn it gains haste, and it's a pirate in addition to its other types. So if you love gaining control of your opponent's creatures, this is a great one for the deck. And moving on to the MVPs of this deck, we have Portraiser, because Delina has to attack. So let's make her attack each opponent by dealing extra combat steps. So whenever Portraiser deals combat damage to a player, we get to untap each creature we control, and after that combat phase, there's an additional combat phase. But Portraiser can't attack a player that's already been attacked this turn. That's why I say there's going to be 3 combats and 3 triggers for Delina. The second MVP is Harmonic Prodigy. If an ability of a shaman or another wizard you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. Well, luckily, our commander is an elf shaman, so we get to double up these attack triggers and roll so many d20s, you're going to get sick of it. The price of this deck is $40, and it really takes advantage of making too many copies. So if you really enjoy that, or you want to try out a mono red deck, this is going to be the one for you. If you liked this video, you're going to love this one right here. If you want to purchase any of these decks, they'll be in the description down below, and thank you to the members who help support this show, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.